If you hear me purr, pretend you didn't.
Hear what?
Hey viewer! Support us on our Patreon to get your own custom stories and animations. And listen to us free on Spotify. Both links are below.
Commander Tavira Seln had led the 3rd Vulpine Expeditionary Wing for 6 years without once raising her voice in combat. Discipline was not a habit for her, it was architecture. It was the frame she had built herself inside, beam by beam, since she was a cadet with ears that betrayed every emotion she felt, and a tail she'd had to learn to hold perfectly, unnaturally still. She remembered the exact moment she had decided to build it. She had been 19, newly commissioned, standing at attention, while a senior officer dressed her down for a tactical error that had cost 2 lives in a training exercise gone wrong. Her ears had flattened. Her tail had tucked. Every soft, readable thing about her had betrayed exactly how devastated she was, and the officer, not unkindly, but not gently either, had told her that a commander whose body narrated her feelings to a room was a commander whose enemies would always know exactly when to press. She had gone back to her quarters that night and practiced, for hours, holding her ears level and her tail still while she recited casualty reports in a mirror. She had done it again the next night, and the next, until stillness became reflex, until reflex became identity, until the officers who served under her stopped remembering that she had ever been anything else. By the time she commanded the evacuation of Corvell Station, that architecture was so complete that her own crew sometimes forgot she was capable of fear at all. They called her the Iron Vixen behind her back. She knew this, had always known this, and had never corrected it, because a reputation like that was worth more to a commander than any medal. The station had been a modest research and relief post, tucked in a neutral corridor between Coalition space and the contested Asher Belt. It should never have been a target. But the raiders who struck it 3 days prior weren't interested in strategic value. They wanted the medical stores, the fabricators, and the 41 human aid workers still inside when the first charges went off. Tavira's wing arrived 11 hours later. 11 hours was an eternity in a siege. By the time her dropship cut through the debris field and punched into the station's ruined docking ring, half the medical unit was already dead, and the survivors were barricaded in a supply bay with failing life support and no weapons. The station's corridors, when her boots finally hit the deck, were a study in violence. Scorch marks bent along the bulkheads like black rivers, atmosphere venting in thin screaming lines from breaches her engineers hadn't yet sealed, the particular metallic stillness of a place that had recently held far more people than it currently did. Tavira moved through it with her sidearm drawn and her voice pitched low and level, calling orders to her strike teams with the same flat calm she used in briefings, because calm, she had learned long ago, was contagious in both directions. Panic in a commander's voice killed people. Calm, projected convincingly enough, sometimes saved them. She led the extraction herself. She always did. It went wrong in the last 90 seconds, the way these things always did. Not in the plan, but in the gap between the plan and the universe's utter indifference to it. They had reached the supply bay. 41 survivors, gaunt and frightened, some injured, all exhausted past the point of relief, the kind of exhaustion where rescue itself becomes almost impossible to believe in, so that Tavira found herself repeating the same reassurances over and over to people who flinched at the sound of her voice before they understood it meant safety and not another threat. Among them was a family, an older human couple, aid workers by trade, and their college-age son, who had come to Corvell Station on a volunteer rotation he'd been talking about for a year, according to the mother's frantic, grateful explanation as Tavira's team began moving them toward the breach. The boy was on a stretcher, a leg wound slowing the whole group's progress, and Tavira had personally taken one end of the stretcher when the assigned soldier went down under a fresh volley of raider fire from the corridor behind them. A raider gunship that should have been disabled wasn't. Her escort's reports had confirmed the kill on it 20 minutes earlier, a confirmation that turned out, in the chaos of battle, to have been premature. It got one clean shot off before her escort finally, truly took it down, and the shot found the supply bay's outer wall exactly as Tavira was pulling the last of the medics through the breach, exactly as the stretcher carrying the injured boy cleared the threshold half a step ahead of her. She saw it coming with the strange, slowed clarity that combat sometimes granted. The wall bowing inward, the structural supports beginning their catastrophic fold, the blast wave a visible thing in the debris-thick air. There was no time to shout a warning that would have mattered. There was only time to move. She turned her body between the blast and the stretcher without appearing to think about it at all. The explosion didn't kill her. It should have. Later, the surgeons would tell her that the only reason it didn't was pure positioning. The angle of her turn, the density of the debris that took her instead of the boy, the sheer luck embedded in physics that had nothing to do with her training and everything to do with chance. She would never quite accept that explanation. She preferred to think, in the small hours when she allowed herself to think about it at all, that some part of her had simply decided the calculation was worth making, and had made it before her conscious mind had time to object. She remembered very little after that. Heat. The taste of copper. Someone's hands, human hands, she would learn, pressing something against her side with a pressure that hurt so much it was almost a mercy, because pain, at least, meant she was still a body that could feel things. "Stay with me," the voice above her had said, low and rough and unhesitating, in a tone that assumed obedience it had no right to assume. "Commander. Look at me. Stay with me." She had wanted to tell him that coalition officers did not take orders from junior medical personnel, human or otherwise. She hadn't had the breath for it. She woke 3 days later aboard the Meridian Hope, a converted cargo hauler pressed into evacuation service, currently limping through unclaimed space toward the nearest friendly relay point with 63 survivors packed into a hull built for 20. The first thing Tavira became aware of was the smell. Antiseptic, recycled air, and the particular staleness of too many bodies in too small a space. The second thing was the pain, a deep, structural ache along her ribs and down through her left hip that told her, with the flat authority of a medical readout, that she had been very badly hurt and was nowhere near recovered. The third thing was the man asleep in the chair beside her cot, arms crossed, chin dropped to his chest, still in a blood-stiffened medic's vest he clearly hadn't had time to change. She catalogued him the way she catalogued everything, efficiently, without sentiment. Human, mid-30s by the lines already starting at his eyes. Dark hair cut short, and now overdue for a trim. A jaw that even in sleep looked set, like he argued with people in his dreams the way he apparently did while awake, if the muttering was any indication. Broad-shouldered in the particular way of someone who'd done manual labor before medicine, or alongside it. His hands, even at rest, looked like they belonged to someone who had held a great many things together that wanted to fall apart. She shifted, testing her own limits, and hissed before she could stop herself. His eyes opened instantly. No grogginess, no transition. Just awake, and focused on her. "Don't," he said, already leaning forward, already reaching for the medical scanner clipped to his belt. "Don't move like that. You've got 2 fractured ribs, a hairline crack in your pelvis, and internal bruising that the ship's medbay isn't equipped to fully image, so unless you enjoy finding out the hard way exactly how bad it is, you're going to lie still and let me look at you." "I am aware of my own condition," Tavira said. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted, and she hated it. "Are you?" He didn't phrase it as a question. He ran the scanner over her anyway, and she let him, mostly because arguing took more energy than she currently possessed. "Commander Tavira Seln, 3rd Expeditionary Wing. I read your file while you were unconscious, so don't bother with the rank and serial routine. I know who you are. I also know you shoved a 19-year-old kid out of a blast radius, and took the debris that would have killed him straight through your side instead, so before you tell me you're fine, I'd like you to sit with the fact that I watched you do that." Tavira said nothing. "Daniel Cross," he added, as if it were an afterthought, though she suspected very little about him was actually an afterthought. "I was station medical staff." Now I'm apparently yours, since you don't currently have one who isn't also a patient. I don't need. You need a lot of things, Commander, and I am uniquely positioned to have opinions about all of them. He set the scanner down. His expression had gone from clinical to something harder to name, not soft, exactly, but attentive in a way that made her want to look away from him. You're not getting out of this cot today. Possibly not this week. I'd like you to hear that now, while I'm calm, instead of in a few hours when you inevitably try to stand up and I have to catch you. I do not fall. You will, Daniel said, with the flat certainty of a man who had already seen the readouts and knew exactly how much blood she'd lost. Everybody falls eventually. The only question is whether someone's there to catch you when you do. She learned, over the following days, that Daniel Cross had not always been a medic. He mentioned it only once, obliquely, while resetting a dressing along her ribs and trying, in his own way, to distract her from the pain of it. I used to work salvage, he said. Deep space wreck recovery, mostly. Pulling cargo, and sometimes bodies, out of ships that didn't make it. Did that for 6 years before I went back for medical training. Why the change? He was quiet a moment, hands steady on her dressing even as something in his face went distant. Pulled a woman out of a wreck once who was still alive. Barely. We didn't have anyone qualified aboard who knew what to do with her beyond basic first aid, and by the time we got her to a proper facility, it was too late. I decided I didn't want to be the kind of person who could only retrieve bodies. I wanted to be the kind who could keep them from becoming bodies in the first place. Tavira absorbed this in silence. It explained things about him she hadn't had a name for yet. The particular stubbornness with which he refused to let patients minimize their own injuries, the way he seemed to take every small victory of a patient's survival almost personally, as though each one were a debt being repaid to someone he hadn't been able to save. You are very insistent, she said eventually, for a man who claims not to want to be in charge of anyone. I'm not in charge of you, Commander. I'm just the only person on this ship willing to tell you no. He finished the dressing and sat back. There's a difference. Is there? There is if you ask me nicely. A ghost of a smile. Which you haven't yet. But I live in hope. She found, to her own quiet alarm, that she was smiling back before she could stop herself. Word of her injuries could not be entirely contained, of course. 63 people in a cramped hall did not permit the fiction that their commander was merely resting. Tavira waited until Daniel left to check on other patients. The Meridian Hope carried 63 souls and precisely one qualified medic, which meant Daniel Cross did not have the luxury of hovering over any single patient for long, commander or otherwise. She used the gap to swing her legs over the side of the cot, plant her feet, and stand. The world went white at the edges. Her knees buckled on the second step. She did not fall, in the end, because Daniel had not gone as far as she'd assumed, and he caught her before her hip could take the full weight of her collapse, one arm hooking under hers, the other bracing flat against her sternum, holding her upright with an ease that suggested this was not the first time he'd caught a patient trying to prove a point. I told you, he said, and there was no triumph in it, which somehow made it worse. Just tiredness, and something that might have been worry dressed up as irritation. Commander. Sit down before you undo 3 days of surgery trying to win an argument with gravity. I have 63 people on this ship who need to know their commanding officer is still capable of leading them, Tavira said, teeth gritted against the pain radiating from her hip. You have 63 people on this ship who need you alive, which is a considerably lower bar and one you are actively failing to clear right now. He eased her back down onto the cot, and his hands were careful, methodical, professionally impersonal in a way she appreciated even as some small, unfamiliar part of her resented it. You want to lead? Lead from here. Give orders. Review the NAV plot. Talk to your officers through the comm. What you cannot do is walk, because your body is currently held together with synthetic graft and stubbornness has a much shorter shelf life. Tavira lay back, breathing hard. humiliation burning hotter than the pain in her side. Vulpine culture did not have a graceful concept for this, for being managed, for being handled like something fragile by a man barely out of his own crisis, still wearing yesterday's blood on his sleeves because there hadn't been time to change. "You may go check your other patients," she said stiffly. "I am capable of remaining horizontal without supervision." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its shadow. "I'll hold you to that, Commander." He didn't go far. She noticed, over the following hours, that he never really did. The turbulence hit 2 days later, without warning, as the Meridian Hope skirted the edge of a debris storm thrown off by some long-dead planetary collision. The ship bucked hard enough to throw an unsecured tray across the medbay, and Tavira, still healing, still fragile in ways she refused to acknowledge aloud, felt the jolt travel straight up through her cracked pelvis like a blade. She didn't cry out. Vulpine discipline held even here. Even now, she simply went rigid, breath punched out of her, hands fisting in the thin blanket hard enough to tear it. Daniel was at her side before the ship finished its second lurch, bracing himself against the frame of her cot, one hand finding hers without asking permission, because in that moment permission was a luxury either of them had time for. "Breathe," he said, low, steady, the same voice he must have used on every terrified patient he'd ever had. "I've got you. Breathe with me. In, that's it, hold it, now out." She hated that it worked. She hated more that her hand, of its own volition, tightened around his, gripping like his presence was the only fixed point in a spinning universe. And then, low in her chest, unbidden, treacherous, it began. A purr. Quiet at first, almost inaudible under the ship's groaning hull, but unmistakable once it started, a deep rhythmic vibration that rose and fell with her breathing, entirely outside her control. Tavira froze. Daniel went very still. For a Vulpine, the purr was not an idle sound. It was not a pleasant hum invented for comfort's sake, the way certain old Earth cultures imagined it. It was the body's oldest, most unguarded language, a physiological response reserved for absolute trust, for the presence of kin, of a bonded partner, of someone whose proximity the nervous system itself had judged to be safe. Officers did not purr in front of their crews. Commanders did not purr in front of strangers. Tavira Seln, who had spent 19 years constructing a reputation for total emotional control, had never once purred in front of anyone outside her own family, and even that had grown rare since she'd taken her commission. She yanked her hand back so fast she nearly reopened the wound at her hip. "That," she said, breathless, mortified in a way that had nothing to do with pain, "did not happen." Daniel's expression was carefully, deliberately neutral, the look of a man exercising enormous effort not to react. "Didn't hear a thing," he said. "I mean it, Cross." Her voice shook, and she despised it for shaking. "If you hear me purr, pretend you didn't. Ever. To anyone." He held her gaze for a long moment. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his eyes. "You have my word, Commander," he said finally. "I didn't hear anything." He believed, she thought, that this would be a promise easy to keep. He was wrong. And so, in her heart of hearts, was she. It happened again 3 days later, when he was cleaning the wound at her hip and had to press against bruised muscle to check the graft was holding. She bit down on the sound this time, teeth clenched, and still it slipped free. Softer this time, almost apologetic, as though her own body were begging his pardon for the confession it kept making. Daniel didn't look up from his work. He didn't smile, didn't comment, didn't so much as let his hands pause in their careful, competent movement across the wound site. He simply continued, steady and unbothered, as if the sound rising from her chest were no more remarkable than her pulse or her breathing. It happened a third time when the ship's power flickered during a systems check and the medbay went dark for 11 seconds, long enough for old instincts, animal instincts, to spike through her before her rational mind caught up. She'd reached out before she could stop herself, found his sleeve in the dark, and he'd covered her hand with his without a word, without hesitation, and the purr had come low and fast, betraying exactly how frightened she'd been. It happened a fourth time during the nightmares. She hadn't told him about the nightmares. She hadn't told anyone. But the medbay was small, and the ship was smaller, and there was nowhere for a commander recovering from near-fatal injuries to hide the sounds of waking gasping from dreams full of blast heat, and the particular terror of watching a wall come apart in slow motion toward a stretcher she couldn't reach in time. The first time it happened, she woke to find him already crouched beside her cot, not touching her, just present, waiting with the patience of a man who had clearly done this before with other patients, and knew better than to grab someone out of a nightmare without warning. "You're on the Meridian Hope," he said quietly, before she could even ask. "You're safe. It's Daniel. Nobody's hurt. You're safe." Her breathing slowed. Her hand found his without her permission, the way it kept doing, as though some part of her had stopped consulting the rest of her about this particular decision. The purr rose, thin and shaking, and this time she didn't have the strength left to be humiliated by it. She simply let it happen, let the sound fill the small space between them, let him hold her hand until her pulse settled and her eyes grew heavy again. The second time it happened, a week later, the dream was worse. Not the ambush this time, but something older, something from earlier in her career that she hadn't dreamed about in years. A training accident where she'd made a call that had cost a cadet under her supervision his life. She woke sobbing before she was even fully conscious, a sound so unlike her that for a moment Daniel simply stared, caught between the medic's instinct to assess and the entirely different, entirely human instinct to simply hold on. He chose the second one. He sat on the edge of her cot, careful of her injuries, and gathered her carefully against his chest, and let her shake against him until the sobs quieted into something smaller, until the purr rose beneath it all, unsteady and raw and entirely unguarded. "I killed the boy," she whispered into his shoulder, so quietly he almost didn't catch it. "Years ago. A training exercise. I made the wrong call and he died, and I have never told anyone that it was my fault, because commanders are not permitted to have made the wrong call, they are only permitted to have learned from it." "You can tell me," Daniel said. "I'm not going to report it up a chain of command. I'm not going to think less of you. I'm just going to listen." She told him. All of it, the exercise, the decision, the years of silence since. He never mentioned it again to anyone, not once. He simply held that, too, the way he held the purring, something entrusted, not something owed. She had spent her whole career being feared, respected, obeyed. She had never, in 19 years of service, been protected by someone who owed her nothing and stood to gain nothing from the effort. It terrified her more than the ambush had. Word of Tavira's condition inevitably reached her senior officers aboard the Meridian Hope. Lieutenant Orrin Vash, sharp-eyed and loyal, and the ship's harried human captain, a merchant-turned-evacuation pilot named Reyes, who had not signed up for any of this and was handling it with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. Vash found Tavira propped up in the medbay reviewing tactical reports on a borrowed data slate, jaw set in the particular way that meant she was pretending the effort of holding the slate wasn't costing her anything. "Commander." Vash's ears had gone flat with worry, an expression she wasn't bothering to hide, which told Tavira more than words would have. "The crew is asking when you'll resume active command." "I have never relinquished command," Tavira said. "You've relinquished the bridge," Vash said carefully. "Which, with respect, is not nothing." Tavira set the data slate down harder than she intended. "I am fully capable of." "You are not," Daniel said from the doorway, arms crossed, in the tone of a man who had clearly been waiting for exactly this conversation and had no intention of losing it. "Lieutenant, with respect, your commander has 2 healing rib fractures, a pelvis that is 1 bad fall away from a surgery this ship cannot perform, and internal bruising I still can't fully image. She is capable of a great many things. Walking to the bridge unassisted and standing a full watch is not currently one of them." Vash's eyes moved between them, something calculating and quietly amused passing behind her expression that Tavira did not care for at all. The commander is welcome to disagree with my assessment, Daniel added, but she'll be disagreeing with a body that keeps proving me right every time she tries. I am in the room, Tavira said icily. I'm aware. He didn't back down. He never backed down, she'd noticed. Not from raiders, not from turbulence, not from a decorated coalition commander glaring at him from a hospital cot. I'm also the only medical authority on this ship, which means my assessment carries actual weight, whether or not you enjoy hearing it. Vash wisely excused herself. But not before catching Daniel's eye on her way out, and giving him a look that was not quite a warning and not quite an approval. Something closer to a lieutenant quietly filing away a fact she intended to revisit later. The silence that followed was heavier than it should have been. Tavira stared at the ceiling, jaw tight, humiliation and something else, something warmer and more dangerous, tangled together in her chest. You do that a great deal, she said finally. Contradict me in front of my own officers. I correct you when you're wrong about your own physical limits, Daniel said, sitting down in the chair beside her cot without being asked, the way he'd started doing without either of them commenting on it. There's a difference. I'd never contradict your tactics. I don't know the first thing about running a wing. But I know bodies, Commander, and yours is telling me things you keep refusing to admit. And what is it telling you? He was quiet a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its clinical edge. That you'd rather die proving you don't need help than live having accepted it. And I'd like you to survive this, Tavira. So you'll forgive me if I keep making that harder for you. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed. She suspected he had too, and that neither of them was ready to acknowledge it out loud. Daniel found the reference 3 nights later, buried in an old coalition cultural briefing document he'd pulled up out of nothing more than stubborn curiosity, unwilling to keep witnessing something he didn't understand. Vocalization, colloquially, purring, is understood among Vulpine physiologists as an involuntary parasympathetic response indicating the presence of a trusted bond, typically kin, chosen family, or a mate. It is neurologically distinct from vocalizations of pain or distress and cannot be consciously suppressed once triggered. Cultural norms strongly discourage its expression outside private or intimate contexts. Suppression in public settings is considered a mark of discipline, and its accidental expression is often experienced as deeply exposing. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a long time in the dim, humming quiet of the medbay after the rest of the ship had gone to sleep shift, watching Tavira breathe in the low light, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes late at night on a ship far from anywhere familiar, exactly what he'd been given and exactly how carefully he needed to hold it. It wasn't a comfort reflex, the way he'd assumed. It wasn't her body simply reacting to gentle treatment the way any patient's might. It was her body recognizing him. Choosing him, on some level far below conscious thought, as safe, as something closer to family than a coalition commander should ever feel toward a human medic she'd known for barely 2 weeks. He found himself, in the days that followed, watching her differently, not as a patient to be managed, but as a person he was beginning, against every ounce of professional caution he possessed, to want in ways that had nothing to do with medicine at all. He noticed the particular way her ears tracked sound even when the rest of her face stayed perfectly composed. He noticed that she still made her bed, every morning, with military precision, even from a cot she could barely sit up in. He noticed that she asked after other patients before she ever asked after herself, and that when Vash brought word of the crew's morale, Tavira's first question was always whether anyone was going hungry, and only ever second whether anyone doubted her. He didn't know what to do with any of it. He knew, with total certainty, that he wasn't going to do anything that made her regret it. It was Vash, in the end, who forced the issue into the open, not maliciously, but with the blunt practicality of an officer who had watched her commander's guarded heart for 6 years and recognized, perhaps before Tavira did, what was happening to it. She found Daniel alone in the galley, nursing a cup of the ship's terrible reconstituted coffee, and sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation. You should know, Vash said without preamble. That in 19 years of service I have never once heard Commander Seln raise her voice, admit fear, or ask for help. Not from me. Not from her own family, as far as I'm aware. She built herself into something very hard to reach a long time ago, and most people who try to reach her anyway don't make it very far before she puts them somewhere safely outside the wall. Is there a question in this, Lieutenant? There is. Vash studied him with the same sharp assessment she likely applied to hostile skin readings. Are you reaching for her because you pity her, Mr. Cross? Because she is injured and frightened and you are the only person she currently has access to? Or is it something else? Because if it's the former, I would ask you to stop now, gently, before she is well enough to notice the difference, and it costs her something she can't afford to lose twice. Daniel set his cup down. It's not pity, he said, and he was surprised by how certain his own voice sounded. I've had plenty of patients who needed comfort. This isn't that. I don't think I could tell you exactly what it is yet. But it isn't that. Vash held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, apparently satisfied, or at least willing to withhold further judgment. Good, she said, rising. Because she doesn't let people in easily, Mr. Cross. But when she does it completely, and if you break that, you will not merely be dealing with a wounded commander. You will be dealing with me. Understood, Lieutenant. Good, she said again, and left him alone with his cooling coffee and the uncomfortable, exhilarating awareness that he had just been quietly, thoroughly vetted, and had, apparently, passed. The Meridian Hope's luck ran out on the 9th day. A coalition relay buoy that should have guided them safely around the edge of contested space had been sabotaged, whether by the same raiders who'd struck Corvell Station or some other opportunist, no one could say. The ship's navigation computer, trusting bad data, took them directly into a patrol lane held by hostile forces. They were spotted within the hour. The Meridian Hope, unarmed, overloaded, limping on damaged engines, had no chance of outrunning anything. Captain Reyes did the only thing available to her. Killed all non-essential power, went dark, and drifted into the shadow of a shattered moon, praying the enemy patrol scanners wouldn't catch the heat signature of 63 frightened people trying not to breathe too loud. It worked for a while. Long enough for them to assess the situation, stranded, powered down, 6 days from the nearest friendly relay if they dared restart the engines, and no guarantee the patrol wouldn't circle back. The first hours of the standoff were the worst kind of waiting, 63 people crammed into a cold, dark hull, engines silent, air recyclers throttled down to their lowest safe setting, every voice reduced to a whisper for fear that sound alone might somehow betray them to sensors that could not, in truth, hear anything at all. Children who did not fully understand why they had to be quiet grew fretful. Adults who understood all too well grew grim and silent in the particular way of people rationing their own fears so it would last. Tavira, against every medical recommendation, insisted on being carried to the bridge. I will not lead 63 people to their deaths from a cot, she told Daniel, when he tried, one last time, to argue her out of it. Her voice had none of its usual coolness. It was raw, urgent, terrified in a way she rarely allowed herself to sound. If I die getting them home, that is an acceptable outcome. What is not acceptable is dying in this bed while people who trusted me to protect them are killed because their commander was too proud, or too broken, to try. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then, without another word of argument, he helped her stand. If you collapse, he said, bracing her weight against his side as they made their slow, agonizing way toward the bridge, I am carrying you back here myself, and you will not argue about it. Deal? Deal, Tavira said, and meant it, which surprised them both. The plan Tavira devised was audacious even by her own standards. A slow, silent drift using only maneuvering thrusters, no main engine burn, threading the ship through the debris field on nothing but momentum and the desperate hope that the patrol's scanners would read them as more wreckage among the shattered moon's ring of broken rock. It required someone to remain at the aft thruster controls, manually adjusting trim by hand, because the automated systems drew too much power and risked lighting them up like a signal flare. It was slow, exhausting, precision work, and Tavira, still barely able to stand unassisted, insisted on doing it herself, because she trusted no one else's instincts as much as her own after 19 years flying wings through worse. Daniel stayed with her the entire 11 hours it took. Twice during that long drift, the patrol's own scanning sweep passed close enough that Tavira had to kill even the maneuvering thrusters entirely, letting the ship coast unpowered and unguided for terrifying stretches of silence while a hostile ship's running lights crawled slowly across the viewport, close enough that individual hull markings were visible, close enough that everyone on the bridge stopped breathing entirely until it passed. The second time, a fragment of debris struck their outer hull with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the dead silence, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved, certain they had been found. They hadn't. The patrol ship continued on, oblivious, and the collective breath the bridge crew had been holding came out all at once in a ragged, whispered exhale that was almost a sob. Daniel didn't argue this time. He understood by now that some fights weren't his to win. That Tavira's identity as a commander wasn't a costume she could set aside just because her body was broken underneath it, and that asking her to abandon her post in the moment her people needed her most would cost her something he had no right to take. Instead, he sat beside her at the thruster console, monitoring her vitals on a handheld scanner, feeding her water and small bites of ration bar between adjustments, and when her hands began to shake from exhaustion somewhere around hour 8, he simply reached over and steadied them with his own, guiding the controls together without a word. The Purr started somewhere around hour 9 and never really stopped. She didn't ask him to pretend this time. She didn't have the strength left to be embarrassed. She simply let it rise and fall beneath her ragged breathing, let it exist in the narrow, dark space between them while the ship drifted silent through debris and enemy scanners swept past without finding them, and somewhere in that long, terrified, tender stretch of hours, something between them shifted from unspoken to simply true. "Tavira," Daniel said quietly, near the end, when the patrol's signature had finally faded from the scopes and the worst of the danger had passed. "When this is over, whenever we're somewhere safe, whenever you're healed, I'd like to talk. About this. About us. If there's an us to talk about." She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the console, hands steady now on the controls. But her voice, when it came, was softer than he'd ever heard it. "There is," she said. "I would like that too." They never got the chance, not then. The relay point came into range on the 6th day, exactly as projected, a coalition way station bristling with friendly ships, close enough now that Reyes finally dared to light the main engines and run for it. It should have been the easy part. It should have been relief. It was, instead, when everything Tavira had been holding together through sheer will finally gave out. She was on the bridge when it happened, standing against every order Daniel had given her, because she would not be carried into friendly space like cargo, because some final scrap of pride demanded she walk onto that rescue vessel on her own feet in front of the people she'd led through 6 days behind enemy lines. She made it as far as the airlock connecting the 2 ships. The survivors were already filing through ahead of her, tearful, relieved, calling her name, reaching for her hands as they passed. She smiled at each of them, steady, composed, every inch the commander they needed her to be. Vash fell in beside her, offering an arm. Tavira waved away without looking, still determined to finish this last, symbolic stretch under her own power. And then her legs simply stopped working. Daniel caught her before she hit the deck. He'd been close, he was always close, some instinct in him having learned over these 2 weeks exactly how far behind her he needed to stay to catch her without seeming to hover. He went down to one knee under her weight, one arm wrapped around her back, the other cradling her head, and felt her body go slack against him in a way that had nothing to do with willed calm and everything to do with a body that had simply run out of reserves. "Tavira." His voice cracked on her name, all the careful clinical distance gone. "Tavira, stay with me. Look at me. Stay with me. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, finding his face with visible effort. Her lips moved. No sound came out. Medic! He was shouting, though he was the medic, though there was no one left to shout for but the rescue ship's own overwhelmed staff already rushing toward them. I need a stretcher. I need a full trauma team. She's crashing. He scooped her up properly then, careless of protocol, careless of his own strained back, and carried her across the threshold between the two ships himself, refusing to let go of her even as the rescue crew tried to take her from his arms. Her hand found his sleeve, weak, trembling, the last of her strength spent on that single small motion. And beneath the frantic activity, beneath the shouted orders and the blaring alarms, so faint he had to lean close to hear it at all, the sound rose from her chest one more time. A purr. Fading, thready, barely audible, but present. Still choosing him, even now, even as her body failed around it. I hear you, Daniel said close to her ear, voice breaking entirely as the trauma team finally pulled her from his arms onto a proper stretcher. I hear you, I always heard you, and it's the sound I want to protect for the rest of my life, so don't you dare stop making it. Do you understand me? Don't you dare. Her eyes closed as the stretcher rushed her away from him, down a corridor he wasn't permitted to follow into. He stood in the airlock a long time afterward, hands shaking, blood, hers, he realized distantly, drying on his sleeves, and understood for the first time in 2 weeks of relentless competence exactly how frightened he had been the entire time, and had simply never had the space to feel it until now. Vash found him there 20 minutes later, still standing, still staring at the corridor, and said nothing at all, only stood beside him, a silent witness to a vigil he had no official right to keep, until word finally came that Tavira had made it out of triage and into surgery alive. She survived. It took the trauma team 6 hours of surgery to confirm it, and Daniel spent every minute of those 6 hours in a waiting area not designed for the kind of waiting he was doing, pacing a strip of deck plating he would later swear he'd worn thin. She survived, but recovery was not a single dramatic moment, it was weeks. Weeks in a proper medical facility at the Coalition Relay Station, weeks of surgeries and physical therapy and the particular, grinding tedium of a body relearning how to be whole. Weeks during which Daniel, no longer her assigned medic, no longer bound by proximity or duty, had every reasonable excuse to simply go home, resume his own life, let the intensity of a shared crisis fade the way such things usually did once the crisis itself was over. He didn't take the excuse. He visited every day the station allowed it, and on the days it didn't, he found reasons, supply requests, reports, anything, to be somewhere nearby. The early visits were quiet, almost formal, both of them uncertain, now that the emergency no longer forced their hands, how to speak to each other without it. Tavira, heavily sedated for the first several days, barely registered his presence at all, though the nursing staff mentioned, almost in passing, that her vitals settled noticeably whenever he was in the room, a detail Daniel filed away and said nothing about. As she grew stronger, the visits grew longer, and the silences between them grew easier rather than more strained. He brought her Rio coffee once, smuggled in from the station's single overpriced cafe, and she drank it with an expression of such profound gratitude that he laughed for the first time in days. She, in turn, began asking him questions about his life before medicine, about the salvage years, about the wreck he couldn't save, about a childhood on a mining colony he mentioned only reluctantly and then, once started, couldn't quite stop describing. There was one difficult evening, near the midpoint of her recovery, when a visiting coalition officer, an old colleague of Tavira's, stiff with formality and clearly unaware of the past weeks, made a passing, careless joke about commanders who let themselves get coddled by attending medics. Tavira's spine had gone rigid, old armor snapping back into place so fast Daniel could almost hear it, and for the rest of that visit she was distant with him in a way that frightened him more than her collapse had, because it looked so much like retreat. He didn't push. He simply came back the next day, as he always did, and said nothing about it, and waited. It took her 2 more days to apologize. I am not accustomed, she said stiffly, staring at the wall rather than at him, to being perceived as someone who needs coddling. It unsettled me more than it should have. I did not mean to be cold with you. You weren't cold, Daniel said. You were scared. There's a difference, and I've told you that before. She turned to look at him then, something loosening in her expression. You are remarkably patient for a man who has no obligation left to be. I'm not patient because I'm obligated, Tavira. I'm patient because I want to be here. He held her gaze. That hasn't changed since the ship? It isn't going to. He had told her, in the desperate honesty of that long, dark drift through enemy space, that there might be in U.S. He had meant it. But honesty born of crisis was a fragile thing, he knew. He had seen it before, in other patients, other survivors, intensity mistaken for permanence once the danger that created it had passed. He did not know, sitting beside her hospital bed with proper walls between them and the vacuum of space, whether what she felt for him would survive contact with an ordinary, undramatic life. He did not know whether she would still want it, once the emergency that had thrown them together no longer demanded his constant presence. He was, in this one narrow respect, still afraid too. He came to see her on the day her doctors finally cleared her to walk unassisted. A small, unremarkable milestone that felt, to both of them, larger than it had any right to. She was sitting up in bed when he arrived, dressed in her own clothes for the first time in weeks instead of a medical gown, hair loose instead of regulation bound, looking, Daniel thought, more like herself than she had at any point since he'd first knelt over her in the wreckage of Corvell Station. Commander, he said in the doorway, with the faint, careful formality of a man who had rehearsed this moment more than he wanted to admit, and still didn't quite trust himself not to fumble it. Daniel. She said his name the way she had that night on the thruster console, soft, unguarded, without rank or distance in it. Come in. Sit. He did. The chair beside her bed was, he noted, in exactly the same position relative to her as the one beside her cot on the Meridian Hope had been. He wondered if that was deliberate. He suspected it was. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of two people who had already said the hardest things to each other, and were simply working up the courage to say the next ones. I've thought about what I said, Tavira began finally. On the ship. That there might be in us. Daniel's chest tightened. And I find, she said, that 6 weeks of ordinary hospital tedium, with no ambush and no enemy patrol and no crisis to manufacture intensity, has not changed my answer. If anything, it has clarified it. I no longer have the excuse of danger to explain why I want you here. I simply want you here. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I was going to say something similar. Less eloquently, probably. You are rarely eloquent, Tavira agreed, and there was warmth in it now, none of the old sharpness. It is, apparently, one of the things I have come to value about you. He laughed, a real laugh, the first easy one he'd allowed himself in longer than he could remember. She watched him do it, and something in her chest loosened that had been tight for 19 years. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her hand in his. It was, on its surface, a small gesture. They had done it a dozen times before, in fear, in pain, in the desperate grip of turbulence and nightmares and a slow, silent drift through enemy space. But every one of those times had been born of crisis, of necessity, of a body reaching for safety without asking permission from the mind attached to it. This time there was no crisis. No emergency to hide behind. No injury demanding comfort, no danger requiring reassurance. This time she simply wanted to. The purr began almost immediately. Low, rich, entirely unguarded, filling the small hospital room without hesitation, without the frantic edge of fear that had colored it every previous time. Tavira did not flinch away from the sound. She did not apologize for it, did not brace for his reaction, did not brace for her own humiliation the way she had on that first turbulent night weeks and a lifetime ago. Instead, she held his gaze steady and open in a way he had never seen from her before, and she smiled. Small, genuine, entirely without armor. "You may listen," she said. Daniel's throat tightened. He tightened his hand around hers instead of trying to speak past it, and after a moment found the words anyway. "I always did," he said quietly. "Every single time. I just didn't think you were ready to know that." "I am now," Tavira said. Word traveled fast on a relay station, faster still among a crew who had spent 6 days stranded together behind enemy lines and had grown, in that shared crucible, into something closer to family than colleagues. Vash found out first. She had suspected for weeks, and made no secret of her satisfaction at being proven right, though she delivered her congratulations with a dryness that made both Tavira and Daniel laugh. "I did warn you, Mr. Cross," she said, when she finally cornered him in the station's mess hall. "If you broke her heart, you would answer to me. I confess I am relieved to instead be owed a drink." "I'll buy you 2, Daniel said. "You'll buy me several," Vash corrected, "given how long you made me wait for this." Tavira's return to active duty, when it came, was slower and more deliberate than she would once have accepted. She submitted, for the first time in her career, to a graduated fitness schedule instead of demanding immediate full reinstatement, a concession that cost her something to make and that she made anyway, because she had learned, in the space of 1 impossible month, that discipline and rigidity were not, in fact, the same thing. She kept the architecture she had built inside herself. She did not become a different commander, softer in the ways that would have made her less effective, less trusted, less capable of leading soldiers through the kind of fire that Corvell Station had been. But she learned, slowly, to let certain rooms in that architecture have windows, to let a handful of people close enough to see past the walls without the walls themselves coming down. Daniel remained one of them. Not the only one in time. Vash earned her own window, and eventually so did others, but the first, and in the particular, private language of purring in an otherwise silent room, the one she never stopped choosing. Months later, aboard a different ship, in altogether calmer circumstances, Tavira Seln stood at the observation deck of a coalition cruiser watching a star field she had crossed 100 times before and would cross 100 times again, and felt Daniel's hand find hers without either of them announcing the gesture, the way it had stopped needing announcing months ago. There was no crisis this time. No ambush, no injury, no 6 days stranded behind enemy lines. Only an ordinary evening, an ordinary view, an ordinary hand in hers. The Purr rose anyway, warm and unhurried, filling the quiet observation deck with a sound she had once guarded like a state secret and now let exist as freely as her own name. She had spent her entire career being feared. She had spent it being obeyed, respected, followed into fire without question. She had never, until this stubborn, unhesitating human medic pressed his hand against her wound and refused to let go, been chosen, not for her rank, not for her discipline, not for the armor she'd spent 19 years building around every soft thing she carried inside her. Chosen simply for the sound her heart made when it finally, fully, trusted someone enough to stop hiding. "You may listen," she said again, quieter this time, more to herself than to him, the way she sometimes still did, as if reminding herself it was permitted. And for the first time in her life, Tavira Seln let herself be heard.